Welcome to our podcast, Book Chat Legacies of Learning, where we look at the Islamic intellectual tradition. We look at the past scholars, their production in the past, but we also think about what it means for us as people who are interested in living in the world in this moment. So I have a very distinguished author with us, Professor Wisam Abdul-Jabbar. We're going to be talking about his book, Medieval Muslim Philosophers and Intercultural Communication towards a dialogical paradigm in education. And I hope by the end of this podcast or book chat, you'll be fully informed and you'll be fully encouraged to go and purchase the book, which I think is a very important book, and everybody should be reading it, at least if you're interested in education or in the field of education. So our author, Professor Wisam, holds a PhD from the University of Alberta. He has many prizes and awards, which I won't bore you with, but you can read them in the description of the podcast below. He also received the University of Alberta President's Doctoral Prize of Distinction, among other awards as well, which are again listed in the description for this video. He's currently a visiting professor teaching graduate courses in the Intercultural Communication program at Qatar. So you can find more information there as well. He's a faculty member of the Adult Education Master's Degree program at Yorkville University and a adjunct professor at the University of Alberta in Canada. He's the author of an important book as well, which is Negotiating Diasporic Identity in Arab Canadian Students, Double Consciousness, Belonging, and Radicalization. But today we're going to be talking about this particular book, which I've read. I've actually read it twice, believe it or not. Once when you kindly sent it to me, and then when I realized that we should invite you to our book chat, I read it again just to make sure that I haven't missed anything important that needs to be discussed. I hope I will be able to do that. So Professor Wisam, thank you so much. I know you're somewhere else in the world, but thank you so much for coming and being with us this morning.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's really such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. So I think we'll just dive straight into the book, if that's okay with you. And when I open the book, in the preface, there's a discussion of what's called the pedagogy of discomfort that spurred you, if you like, to undertake this journey of transcending cultural differences and to promote intercultural synthesis. What does this mean, and why is it important?
Well, I always tell my students, that the first step to managing intercultural encounters is not to know about the other cultures, which is usually a common fallacy. It's actually to know more about your own culture, and hence the uncomfortable discovery of how little we know about our own culture and the things that we also take for granted. So this is crucially important, not only because, as Socrates advises, that the unexamined life is not worth living, so similarly, the unexamined culture is not really worth practicing. But also, this is also important because as Muslims, especially living in diaspora, we do not really get to define, but always defend who we are. So as an immigrant, so hence the discomfort. As an immigrant, I always struggled with finding adequate answers when I faced challenging questions, and they are not necessarily that challenging. Even just questions about Islamic practices, cultural practices. So I often just go home vexed and annoyed, disappointed in myself. It's like, this is. I should have known better. I should have said this and I should have said that. And how come I don't know enough? So there's a great deal of discomfort that is part and parcel of intercultural encounters. And it's a learning curve, but it tends to be very uncomfortable. And that's just, it's how things are when we meet diasporic challenges. So
thank you so much. Yeah, no, wonderful. So your book title is quite long. If I just repeat it again, Medieval Muslim Philosophers and Intercultural Communication towards a dialogical paradigm in education. And our viewers will be really interested to know, what does that mean? So can you unpack that for us, if you don't mind?
Sure, yeah. The title refers to medieval Muslim philosophers who had encountered foreignness firsthand and how that impacted their education or their view of education and philosophy. So the title does not include, for example, the names of those philosophers, because the choice of philosophers itself was quite a conundrum for me, to be honest. Um, it's not a matter of name recognition, otherwise, Avicenna would have been there. But I tried to think of their originality within the discourse of intercultural communication and education. So the question for me was who, for example, might be considered as a curriculum scholar and why. So if we stretch the title a little bit to make it more descriptive, it would be something like medieval Muslim philosophers as curriculum theorizers, and their contribution to intercultural ethics practices, something to that effect. So I hope that helps, you know.
Thank you. No, wonderful. That's very useful. So, in chapter 1 of your book, I noticed that
Right.
you talk of three very important themes, which are very, very important to understand and unpack. If I
Mm.
just list them: intercultural communication, interdisciplinarity, and intercultural education. And I wondered if you could, one by one, just explain what they are and or how it works in the chapter.
Yeah, sure. In a Socratic fashion, you know, start with definitions.
Yes.
Um, well, intercultural communication refers to exchange of ideas and information between seemingly different cultures. So it involves differences in values, beliefs, language. It promotes cultural awareness, adaptability, conflict resolution techniques, and cultural learning. Interdisciplinarity is, basically an educational approach, as you know. It integrates contents and approaches from a different academic discourse, a different academic discipline. It encourages making connections between areas of knowledge in order to reach a more holistic understanding of the problem at hand. So there's that. What else? Intercultural education. I look at it as a response, actually, to multicultural education, which I believe has slipped into some sort of a it slipped into mere celebration of diversity and difference. So I believe that intercultural education in this case advocates for intellectual, intercultural, interfaith dialogues, and it's more about discovering commonalities and common grounds as opposed to multicultural education, which really focuses on difference. So,
Thank you so much for that. So I'm just going to go directly to your book now. On page 15, um,
right.
you have you have this phrase which really caught my attention anyway, and I'll just read it out for you. You say that
Mm,
an intercultural approach trains learners to be diplomats, able to view
right.
different cultures from a perspective of informed understanding. So this idea of learners being diplomats really caught my attention, and it's a very vivid description because I can see what's going on there. But can you tell our viewers more by what you mean here?
Right, yeah. I believe that this idea just came to me because at the time I was reading a book by an author, Al-Kawari. Al-Kawari is a Qatari diplomat and politician, and the name of the book is The Global Majlis, um, and it's really fascinating. The book is very conversational. So it talks about the author's experience in diplomacy and politics. But it what caught my attention is that it really identifies four aspects of cultural diplomacy. Engaging with others, exporting your own culture, engaging with non-governmental agencies, not necessarily the state, but not necessarily the official institutions, but communities and activists. And there's also working on, say, certain behavioral patterns. So when I looked at this, and okay, if that's really what constitutes cultural diplomacy, then that's exactly what we teach in intercultural communication. What our students acquire during their training, that really resonates with cultural diplomacy. So it makes sense that intercultural learners are, would-be diplomats. So that's what I had in mind, I suppose, at the time.
Thank you. Now I've got you a little bit warm. Now I've got you a little bit warmed up. I'm going to throw in a question, which I think is relevant to nearly everyone that I know. Is how come Muslims reignite their openness to foreign thought and free themselves from what would be called scripturalism, i.e., just being really very literal, or this form of natural literalism, which sometimes that we often find in education or Islamic education?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very intriguing question. Yes, and it's a tough one too. I believe that a true liberal arts education is really key to reigniting openness. And by liberal arts, I mean what the Greek called the trivium, logic, grammar, and rhetoric. And they are called liberal arts because they liberate the mind, open the mind, liberate it from normative chains, things that we take for granted. But of course, it's not that easy. I mean, there are definitely challenges, such as, for example, it's not that easy to reintroduce philosophy as a core subject in secondary education, because that's not the case now. It's not a core subject. In Canada, for example, if you're an IB student, then you get a core course called Theory of Knowledge. But otherwise, if you're not an IB student, then philosophy is just elective. It's an online course, and it's not something that is, fashionable, so to speak. So students should have a foundation of knowledge of philosophy to be, well versed in liberal arts, in logic and rhetoric, beyond just writing an argumentative essay. The second challenge that I would also like to mention is integrating liberal arts in Islamic studies, and it used to be central to Islamic studies. It used to be part of it. I'm not sure that this is right.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it used to be part. I mean, one of our previous book chats was with Professor Asad Ahmed, who talked about logic and mantiq, and it's very clear it was central to a madrasa education, for example.
Exactly. But I'm not sure if this is, the case any longer. But again, especially within the context of secondary school education, teach philosophy in a way that, there is a practical application to it. Then it makes sense. And then I suppose it starts there. It starts in secondary education where students start developing character. Otherwise, maybe it's just too late for them. But it's definitely one of the ways to develop openness and open-mindedness, for sure.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. Again, staying with contemporary debates. So, I don't know if you've been following the news in the UK here. The politics is always shifting. A day is a very long day in British politics. But there's been discussions in the UK about multiculturalism. And there's been certain ministers talking about how multiculturalism has failed. But as a counterpoint, in your book, you talk about multicultural actually promotes an understanding of tolerance of difference. Interculturalism identify commonalities and develop them through dialogue into shared universals. So you've talked about this. Ministers leaders or saying something else. Is multicultural really possible? Do you think they've missed something?
Well, it is. It is possible if by multiculturalism we mean a society of several ethnic groups who live alongside each other, but do not necessarily intellectually engage with each other. And I think that's the problem, um, which is not really what multiculturalism claims to achieve. And that's again very problematic. Interculturalism, on the other hand, strives to involve communities in deep understanding and sharing ways of being and learning. So I lean more towards interculturalism because of that tendency to engage intellectually in shared values. The problem is that multiculturalism has also recently slipped into a rhetoric of decadence. It's really shooting itself in the foot. For example, one of the biggest misconceptions of or about multicultural education, specifically culturally responsive teaching, is that you have to tie the lessons content to racial background. So they say, you can just mention Africa, mention Mexico, a famous Black or brown high achiever, and that's that. And this is becoming something very fashionable in multicultural education, especially in teacher education programs. Maybe I'm generalizing to a certain extent, but we know it's there. And in reality, culturally responsive teaching is not about using racial pride as a motivator. It's not that at all. It's about mimicking the cultural ways of being and learning from other cultures. These are strategies and life skills that we can learn from their wisdom tradition and their communities. So I believe, for example, as I said, culturally responsive teaching should be about building bridges between home and school, between the local and the global, and not just acknowledging and respecting difference. And that kind of rhetoric, that kind of disposition requires a great deal of intellectual and intercultural engagement. And I'm not sure that multiculturalism has managed to achieve that.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was very, very useful. Yeah, no, thank you so much. On a related note, you talk about synthesis, which really caught my eye because I've written a book, just a chapter rather, on a famous 18th century scholar who was synthesizing many, many strands of knowledge in his own time. And synthesis for you define it as intercultural competency that seeks to integrate, link, and sometimes appropriate information with previously accepted knowledge. I think this is really important for many, many people who are in education or learning or studying or writing. I just wondered if you could explain what synthesis means and how it can be used today.
Sure. Yeah. This is since we've started talking about multiculturalism. I think this is also somehow related to multiculturalism, since it focuses on, as I said, differences and distinctive features of cultures. Synthesis is more about what brings us together and not what separates us. It's the commonalities, the similarities, the shared values, to create a true community and not necessarily uniformity. So this reminds me, for example, of Gadamer's notion of the fusion of horizons in philosophical hermeneutics, which I didn't mention in the book. Now I'm thinking, oh, I should have mentioned that.
Maybe in your next book.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So yeah, Gadamer's fusion of horizons really refers to a process when we engage with a different text or a different perspective, and there's this interplay between two seemingly different horizons. And the goal is to not to completely assimilate one horizon into the other, but to find middle grounds, to allow for a more nuanced and ongoing understanding than just engage in empathy, reconciliation, or tolerance. So I suppose that's my understanding of synthesis.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So in chapter 2 of your book, you have
Right.
an interesting description. This is on page 23. In your book, you describe how medieval Muslim thinkers were mindful to identify the entry points of foreign materials, which were essential to enable a culture to become a distinct civilization without losing its main Islamic or Arabic characteristics. I think this is always a concern for modern Muslims, especially for Muslims who are living in the West, for example, like me, about to what extent can we do this sort of work. So I wonder if you could explain that, what you meant by that, and how it can work perhaps in practice for someone like me living in the West.
Um, well, honestly, in what I had in mind, I suppose, is how medieval Muslim philosophers created Arabic words to represent what Arabic lacked ontologically.
Hmm.
So, for example, Al-Kindi, in his treatise called On the Definitions and Descriptions of Things, in Arabic, في حدود الأشياء ورسومها. So he lists a set of philosophical terms. They're very technical and philosophical in context. And he offers the Arabic alternative. So it was written for readers, for his students, for his colleagues, with the understanding that this integration of philosophy and Arabic is meant also for coming generations, to offer that kind of entry point for them. And these might be just Arabic words, common Arabic words, such as quwwa, which means strength, that he used to mean potentiality. So stuff like that. That's what I had in mind, I suppose.
Interesting. Very, very. I mean, that's still a challenge
Yeah.
today, right? When we translate words from Arabic to English. I mean, when I'm writing, I'm always struggling with, like, how do I make sure this word is accurately represented with everything that comes with it? It's always a challenge.
Exactly. The stuff that is lost in translation,
Yeah,
literally.
yeah, exactly. I always struggle with that. Um, um, in this chapter, in number 2, chapter number 2, there was a few things that struck me, which I think is important for to think about historically, but also in the contemporary age.
Right.
And one of them was state encouragement or patronage, which helped in the pursuit of education and in the pursuit of truth. But you also had the institution of what you call a house of wisdom. Um, and I'm always interested in funding and economics that goes behind any pursuit, especially education. So I was wondering if you
Mm.
could tell me to what extent funding plays an important role, or did play an important role, or can play an important role in Islamic education.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, let's take the House of Wisdom and the translation movement as a case in point.
Mhm.
So it attracted so many scholars from different parts of the world, different religions and ethnic backgrounds across the empire, because there was a culture, of course, of tolerance, but also of financial affluence. The funding was so extravagant for scholars and for scientists, that they could actually make a living from research, and that was something at the time, right? And therefore knowledge reflected status, a rare commodity. So legend has it that they were so well paid that some translators would receive their books weight in gold. So
Wow.
there is that. And another example is of patronage is Al-Ma'mun himself, the caliph, who regularly initiated meetings and sessions for thinkers to come over and share their discoveries and in a very open intellectual manner. And it was a common practice at the time, to have people in research clusters or translation circles to be funded, and maybe also to come over to the court and share their discoveries. But let me say here also that this wasn't exclusively about knowledge. It was equally entertaining. I mean, think of these sessions as something similar to modern TV shows such as Jeopardy, in which the participants demonstrate intellectual competence, and it's very entertaining. So there's that too, to be fair. But yeah, the role of patronage and funding was definitely central.
And if I can ask you a question, if you were to come across a donor, a generous donor, or a patron, and he said to you, "Look, what would your message be to a patron right now? If you met a patron, what would you say about what they could do? What should they invest in when it comes to what you're talking about?"
We talked about, open-mindedness and the importance of liberal arts in education. So maybe there's that, to invest in a program or in a course that really caters for that. I mean, there are also even, portals, online courses portals. Maybe we can invest in that. Maybe we can design a course that is about open-mindedness or about liberal arts in Islamic education for the public, not necessarily for students, because that's definitely very, very important to recommend for Muslim youth in general, especially in diaspora, or people who are just commonly interested. It doesn't have to be Muslims. So there's that.
Yeah. No, thank you. And hopefully there'll be someone who's listening, a donor maybe, and they can get in touch with you. So in chapter 3, you talk about the dialogical paradigm, which I think is very, very interesting. Can you, for our readers, explain what a chapter is about and what you mean by a dialogical paradigm?
Yeah, this is definitely central to the book. The dialogical paradigm challenges the dogmatic reality of education, predetermined knowledge. It fosters situations and possibilities in which two different realities coexist and converge. So basically, this is what intercultural communication does, the exchange of information between members of different cultures. That exchange should be fair and should speak to both parties. So it's a process, but it's a process that is not trapped in argumentation. It's a position where you develop the ability to identify similarities, discover similar and shared values, which makes coexistence possible. I'm not sure focusing on difference is helpful at this point. So the dialogical paradigm focuses on a nuanced appreciation of context, guided by the willingness to engage in dialogue, to listen. There's this proverb. I'm not sure if it's in Arabic, but it just comes to me. It says, if you listen, you learn. If you stay quiet, you stay out of trouble. So listening is key in dialogue, and not just speaking. So, but generally speaking, I digress. Dialogic education encourages students to look for alternatives, to engage in controversial issues and not to shy away from it, and to try to find the alternative by looking at different cultural perspectives, to learn through interacting constructively with other viewpoints and texts, looking for commonalities. So the dialogical is and exchange that ensures that kind of synthesis that we talked about previously.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And so, based on what you just said, there may be some people who say that there are actually genuine differences, which are simply irreconcilable, and that we must be careful about falling into what they would say relativism, where each claim is granted the same epistemological or truth claim. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, that's a real problem, I know. And thank you for bringing this up. Look, one thing for sure, a culture impervious to rational thinking will remain a cult, will never become a civilization. So, what I'm saying is a culture that is pre-philosophical, or if it prescribes intellectual uniformity, then there's not really much that we can do. And that kind of culture slips into a cult and can hardly achieve any dialogical level, let alone universalism. And perhaps this is, again, going back to our discussion about multiculturalism. This is one of the limitations of multicultural education, which proposes that all cultural practices and beliefs are equally valid and should be respected, but often without scrutiny. Now, I'm not saying that all cultures need to be grounded in liberal democracy. I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
But if they are anti-common sense, the dialogue stops there. So multicultural education should therefore strike a balance between, appreciation of diverse cultures and the advocacy for universal values, for common sense. So, for example, if a particular culture promotes fictitious knowledge over factual information and gender inequality and advocates for mythos predominantly over logos, then it's really important to address such tenuous assumptions rather than simply accepting them as equally valid and equally valuable.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you. That's so useful. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you so much. After reading your book a few weeks ago, I tweeted this. It's a question I it was amusing that I put on social media. I hope I won't regret it. But I'll just read it out. How do we move from a discourse only of resistance and seeing the past simply in aesthetic or nostalgic terms, i.e. romanticizing the past? Can we capture an essence of the past that's applicable today? So I think you can understand what I'm trying to say. We kind of really become stuck in the past and nostalgia of the past, or this golden age, quote unquote, that we sometimes refer back to. How can we go back to our past and find its application today? Can you help with this answer?
I think that's a very important question. I'm not sure I have a ready-made answer, but I'll tell you that. In reviewing the philosophers and philosophies I used in the book, I've seen evidence of proper practice, something cyclical, something that keeps coming, something that keeps recurring. And it seems to me, this ties up with my just previous discussion of cultures and civilizations. And it seems to me that every culture that aspires to become a civilization must develop patterns that allow for various possibilities and various interpretations. And these possibilities, which were developed by medieval Muslim philosophers, offered Islamic thought a chance of renewal, looking for such interpretive frameworks that offer universal values and practices, and try to create our own interpretive frameworks, building on theirs. The approach, for example, to reconcile foreign thought with Islamic and foreign tradition with Islamic thought, that attitude can be so helpful today to negate radical thinking and engage fairly with different worldviews and realities, but also to engage with the internationalization of education, for example. So that kind of attitude is something that we can really pick up and use nowadays.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to dive into some of the thinkers that you mentioned and you engage with in your book. So in chapter 4, you engage with Al-Kindi, or Abu Yusuf Yaqub bin Ishaq Al-Kindi, and you
Right,
explore how he was arguably the first in its Arabic intellectual tradition to initiate a move from majlis to minhaj. Uh,
right.
this is from the masjid learning practices centered on theological studies to schooling. That's an important shift. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And he's one of my favorite philosophers. Uh, well, Al-Kindi lived in a time where there was no schooling. Now, I mean, as we know it today. So I argued that, sorry, in his work on Greek scholarship, he promoted a shift, pedagogical curriculum-oriented shift from majlis to minhaj. And majlis, as you know, in Arabic means a place to sit, a space, but usually within the mosque. That's how the whole thing started, in which teaching and learning occurred at the time. So during Al-Kindi's time, during the 9th century, schools were formed around masters, individual masters. And we know that because this kind of orientation led to the emergence of the four Sunni schools of thought, the madhabs, towards the end of the 13th century. But in pre-madrasa era, three dominant pedagogical domains appeared. The majlis, the masjid, of course, and the majlis and the halaqa. But they all figured prominently as a meeting of students with a professor. So that was the norm, in spite of the different orientations and different domains. But it was very professor, master oriented. And I argue that Al-Kindi's attitude towards curriculum development provided a decentralizing attitude, something different manifested, to me at least. So, for example, if we look at Al-Kindi's corpus, which was enormous, and we know that from a book called Fahrast, which means the list, written by 10th century writer Ibn Nadim. So based on Al-Fahrast, that book, Ibn Nadim lists the books or the works written by Al-Kindi, and it's over 300 titles in there. We know, again, based on that book, that 21 are philosophical works, and there's 10 books or 10 titles about logic and practical philosophy. But the rest of Al-Kindi's, contributions and works are, entirely unphilosophical, featuring a wide range of topics. And so there was a problem for historians, especially when they look at the list in terms of the choice of genre. Why did Al-Kindi, for example, choose mainly to write in the form of rasail, which is Arabic for epistles or letters, addressed specifically to individuals, to students? Numerous letters were, addressed to his student Ahmed, the caliph's son, among other unnamed, students. So why focus on letters and epistles and stuff like that? And my assumption, my argument was that he was creating study guides as subjects for a curriculum. The absence of the physical professor was there. It's like when we read study guides today, so the idea of writing study guides and writing letters, that really, for me, was the initiation of creating a minhaj. And it justifies the genre choice. And for me, it initiated that shift towards curriculum writing. So that's, my take on the subject.
No, thank you. And if I might just build on that, in the same chapter, you talk about this distinction, if you like, between disciplinary boundaries versus an encyclopedic approach. And you have a passage in there which is very, very fascinating on page 76, where you talk about interdisciplinarity, what was a method that Al-Kindi strove to establish. And then on page 79, you have this little phrase where you talk about a space of generative possibilities, which was really
Right.
fascinating. So I wonder if you could talk about that a little for me, please.
Yeah, for sure. I guess I refer to space of generative possibilities as a space that is beyond our comfort zone. Um, I think we keep encountering this. We're going, back for full circle to this pedagogy of discomfort, which is essential to critical thinking, no doubt. So, a space of generative possibilities is, something that is beyond comfort zone, and what lies beyond comfort zone is the learning zone, is the serious, actual learning, thought provocative learning zone, which can be also, compared to the zone of proximal development. That's a concept in educational psychology that was developed and introduced by Gotsky. And the zone of proximal development represents a space between what a learner is capable of doing, unsupported by professors or by any resources, and what the learner cannot do even with the presence of that support. And therefore, this is an opportunity to generate. But unfortunately, we're not there. I don't think this is something that is manifesting itself in education nowadays. I'm afraid we're slipping into a zone of minimal development as opposed to proximal development because of the lack of intellectual, engagement, and the lack of also interdisciplinary rigor, and because we're too much focused on disciplinarity, you know. So that's what I had in mind.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. I want to move on to the next chapter, Al-Farabi.
Right.
You bring me Al-Farabi. I'd like to know more about him. Our viewers would love to hear more about him. But if I may also add, you propose here a three values, if you like, or intercultural communication values,
Yeah.
itisal, musamaha, and fadl, which is kind of like a tripartite model of
Right.
dialogical
Right.
education. So can you tell us more about Farabi, the man himself, and then talk about this tripartite model that you have there?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I looked at Al-Farabi as a synthesizer of a philosophy of education, more specifically as a system developer. One of the scholars actually calls him a system developer in education philosophy. And Al-Farabi was born in Farab, um, Turkestan, and he's a 10th century philosopher who studied logic in Baghdad. He was linked to Syriac, Neo-Aristotelian tradition. He visited Egypt. He did most of his writing also in Damascus and Aleppo. He was known to speak several languages. I'm not sure how, you know, I'm not sure we have concrete evidence to support that, but it's he was known to be able to speak in different languages. We know that he was a skilled musician, and we know that he wrote a now lost autobiographical track um, called "The Rise of Philosophy." So his education demonstrates that he's well trained in Syriac tradition, in Aristotelian logic, and in Hellenistic philosophical legacy. So, to the extent that his contemporaries considered him the second, or called him the second teacher, the first, of
Mm,
course, is Aristotle. So that's Al-Farabi. And your second question was again,
the tripartite model that you develop in that chapter.
right,
Yeah.
right. So yeah, um, and so one example, for example, of that tripartite Farabi model, in which for me contributes to applied modalities, and modalities in the field of curriculum theorizing and the ethics, the intercultural ethics that need to be embedded in curriculum theorizing. So, for instance, in his book, The Virtuous City, inspired by Plato's Republic, not only does Al-Farabi synthesize Plato's vision, but he also makes sure that that he fine-tunes the final product to be a conscious actualization of universal utopia. It's not a utopia only for Muslims. It's for everybody. It's very inclusive, and we should also be mindful of the very title of the book, which is often just gets cited as the the virtuous city, but in reality, it's the opinions of the people of the virtuous city. آراء أهل المدينة الفاضلة, right? So the internalized ethics of the people, the dwellers of the virtuous city. So it's direct reference to the idea that intercultural and behavior and cultural practices internalized by the dwellers of the city is something that's really important and matters. And this is, of course, reference to Ahl al-Madina, the people of the city, when they encounter foreignness. What's their response to that? What's their opinion about that? So, in other words, what I mean to say here, that he really realized that the locality of culture lies outside the parameters of what we conceive to be home. It's only when we respond to something that is foreign, we know who we are. So the neighborly feelings of that culture really, determine the nature of that contact with foreignness, and also determine our attitude and behavior. And that's why I argue that these three ethical skills serve the inquisitor and the intercultural learner very well.
Yeah, no, it's very rich. I really enjoyed that chapter. Thank you so much for writing that chapter.
Thank you.
We move to someone that's very well known, I think, to many of us in education, Imam Ghazali. And of course, a lot has been written on him as well. And you talk about him in your book, and you draw on his epistemological and educational views to show how the rihla manifests as a sojourn across cultural borders and an intellectual journey across disciplines. I'm really fascinated with that. Can you explain that for our viewers?
Yes, absolutely. Rihla, means a journey, a sojourn. It's travel, basically. But it offers an opportunity to cross boundaries. I mean, hypothetically, to abandon regimented study and thinking and promote dialogue and interaction. And there's this medieval scholarly fascination with interdisciplinary rigor and different perspectives, especially related to Rihla. There's also like a cult of young scholars who are just fascinated with Rihla and with travel as a means to learn. And this is relevant nowadays because I believe that this medieval scholarly fascination with interdisciplinarity negates contemporary reluctance, often disavowed. We're almost in denial, to abandon disciplinary focus and figuratively sail, perilously closer to the shores of other academic disciplines. Because as professors, what we do is we ask our graduate students to go and take non-departmental courses. That's fine, but we rarely venture likewise. And the sojourner is therefore an intellectual mediator, somebody who is willing to take that risk. All right, so that's what really explains the importance of Rihla for me.
Yeah. And it's really fascinating, just to kind of build on what you're saying. On page 120, you talk of knowledge as an assemblage are always in flux, and only a scholarly attitude that is equally migratory and nomadic, represented by Rihla, is capable of capturing synthesis. And this was really fascinating because, again, synthesizing, when I was reading that, so synthesizing, what you're talking about, is that I remember Ibrahim Musa's book, Ghazali and the Poetics of Imagination, and
Right.
he has the idea of bricolage in that book, and he's also one of our advisors on our project, like yourself, and he's going to be coming on our podcast soon as well. I found this posture really, really fascinating, and it's something. I mean, you alluded to it in your previous response about there's a sort of reluctance to do this, or people don't venture out and do this as much as the scholars of the past. So we sometimes talk about these scholars of the past, but we don't really actually we don't build on their modalities. We don't adapt or adopt their modalities.
Right. There is this kind of reluctance, yes.
Yeah, and it reminds me of how I was reading something recently about how scholars talk about. Someone was writing about how they say they follow scholars of the past in their legal views or in their theological positions, but then he was going further and saying, well, why don't you adopt everything that he was doing in the way that he approached knowledge systems? Why is it that people are always selective in quoting or using scholars of the past?
Right.
And I think that's really, really important to what you're doing about intercultural education here.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. Yeah, it definitely takes me back to the importance of interdisciplinary training to capture this shifting nature of knowledge, knowledge being subject to time and change. So a holistic understanding of complex issues by integrating insights from different perspectives and different academic programs and disciplines really encourages problem solving and negates a very orthodox approach to current challenges. And therefore, knowledge is always in flux. And maybe this is something that I just stumbled upon. My training is very interdisciplinary, and it helped me a great deal to come up with ideas and stuff. So it's the curriculum as lived that really spoke to me.
Yeah, thank you. We're moving on to chapter 7 of your book, Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, as he's known in Europe or in the West. You talk about him, you talk about how his oeuvre won ascendancy in Europe. And that's really interesting. So I wonder if you could tell our viewers a little bit about who he is, first and foremost. And you mentioned that he lived in very interesting times, because for him, Aristotelian thought offered a dialogical glue that could hold society together in what's a defragmented, multi-ethnic, and a multi-faith socio-political fabric. So I think that's very relevant as well to sort of what's happening in certain parts of the world today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me start by saying that in the Vatican, in Rome, there is a fresco painted by the Italian Renaissance artist Raphael, called the School of Athens. It's gigantic and it's very, very popular. The painting included almost, well, not all of them, but many philosophers from ancient Greece. All the philosophers depicted in that painting belong to the Western tradition. Now, there's one unusual exception in the painting. That exception is Averroes. He was painted as a man wearing a turban, brooding over on the left of the painting between Epicurus and Pythagoras. And Raphael, the artist, gave an Arab and a Muslim a permanent spot among the greatest, Western thinkers, as a distinctive confirmation of an intercultural value in a room painted for the Pope's library in the 16th century. So this is fascinating, which speaks about his status in Europe. The other thing that I also want to mention about Averroes, and this is equally fascinating, is that he appears in Dante's Divine Comedy. he appears in one level of hell among the non-Christian writers, of course, which was the greatest compliment Dante, can ever bestow on a pagan, right? Considering that this is a Christian cosmos. So he was named there. Averroes was named there with Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Galen, and with him, of course, Dante refers to Averroes, with him who made that commentary vast, Averroes. But Averroes is basically Ibn Rushd, often Latinized as Averroes. He is an Andalusian polymath and jurist, wrote many subjects, and he lived during the 12th century. So
yeah. And in the same chapter, on page 137, you talk about the pedagogy of deliberation. And that section was very, very fascinating. I wonder if you could tell our viewers more about what you mean by the pedagogy of deliberation, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was an attempt on my part to, merge Islamic thought as represented by Averroes with the Western pedagogical tradition. Deliberative pedagogy, it's something that was introduced by, it's part and parcel of the Western tradition of the internationalization of education, but basically a deliberative approach to education requires an intellectual and ethical commitment, a refusal to divorce philosophy from education. So it's very rationalistic, and it seeks decision-making, but it's also very pluralistic, and it depends on a collective vision. So it's not Western in the sense that it's very Eurocentric. That's not what I meant. And it really distinguishes itself in sharp contrast to the technocratic, outcome-oriented approach. As I said, it's very oriented into decision-making process. So what students need to do actually is to conceive a problem, and then create and weigh likely alternative solutions to the problem. Envision a probable result, an alternative, and then select or develop the best course of action to solve that problem based on that deliberation. So that's, the kind of pedagogy. So you can probably see that there is a great sense of an Aristotelian method going on in there that definitely appealed to Averroes.
Thank you. I noticed in your book that if it's not clear to readers, but you favor Al-Kindi. He's a sort of your favorite in there. And you've alluded towards it already. You've sort of alluded to it. But tell us why Al-Kindi? I mean, there could be so many others, but why Al-Kindi for you?
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, it's simple, honestly, for me. It's my Iraqi blood, I suppose. He's my fellow citizen. So there's that. But this man was amazing, during the Dark Ages, when philosophy was almost extinct in Western Europe and barely alive in the Byzantine Empire, we have Al-Kindi, a Basra-born, Baghdad-educated young man who managed to convince the Islamic world of its compatibility with Greek philosophy. That's amazing. Although for me, I introduce him as the first intercultural curriculum theorizer. But again, I can't deny that, his contribution was phenomenal in the sense that, that was the beginning of the bright ages in the Islamic civilization. But basically, it's for these two reasons that I admire him the most.
Thank you so much. Now, your book is filled, brimming with conceptual frameworks and examples. It's early morning for me here. It's just wonderful to start the day with you. And I just want to say once again, thank you so much. You are one of our advisors on our project, Legacies of Learning. So for our viewers, you can click on the link that will be provided to hear and read more about the project. We hope to have more scholars, academics, leading thinkers on this topic on our future podcast. This is the book. by Professor Wisam. Please do buy it and read it, and you will find lots of rich insights which you can apply in your education and in the teaching that you want to do. And I hope that you'll keep in touch, and please leave your
Absolutely.
comments behind. Yeah, and we'd love to
Absolutely.
hear from
I invite people to contact me to, share their ideas with me. This is why we're here, right?
Yeah,
To
exactly.
communicate.
Exactly. This is about learning. So yeah, please do reach out to Professor Wisam. I reached out to him a long time ago, and I think we've become good friends on the back of that. So please do that. And thank you to everyone. Until next time, thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.